A very good evening to everyone. I hope you are all safe and doing well. Today, we have Professor Apurva D. Patel to address us in the fourth talk of the Coherence lecture series. He was kind enough to accept our invitation. Before I go any further, on behalf of the team Decoherence, we welcome you to today's talk. In this lecture series, we will be hearing from renowned physicists who are actively involved in research with the idea of introducing various areas of physics as well as research methodologies used in those areas to our audience. Professor Apurva D. Patel is a professor at the Center for High Energy Physics at the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru. He is renowned for his work on quantum algorithms and the application of information theory concepts to understand the structure of genetic languages. He obtained an MSc in physics from IIT Bombay and a PhD from California Institute of Technology under the guidance of Jeffrey C. Fox. Richard Feynman was a part of his thesis evaluation committee. He was a postdoctoral research fellow in the University of California, San Diego, as well as a research fellow in the University of Wuppertal, Germany, post which he was a scientific associate at the Theory Division, CERN, Geneva, Switzerland. He joined the Indian Institute of Science as a faculty member in 1989 and was part of Center for Theoretical Studies and SCRC2. He was an associate member of the Indian Academy of Sciences as well as Abdus Salam International Center for Theoretical Physics, Trieste, Italy. So today, Professor Apurva D. Patel will be discussing topics in the quantum mechanics and algorithms, as well as he will be taking questions from the audience. So feel free to ask as many questions as you wish to. I request the audience to use the Q&A box to ask questions. The questions will be read out by the moderators, and the moderators for today's session are Rishik, Shamadeep, me, Abhipsha, Arithro, Irish, and Nikita. Without further ado, I request Professor Apurva D. Patel to address the audience.
It is not at all clear. So last year I had tried an experiment together with Professor Krishnamurthy that we used to have a meeting once a week after 5 o'clock with students in the physics lecture hall, and the students can ask whatever questions they had in mind, not necessarily even physics, anything in science, and we would basically try to answer as well as we can. It was informal, but it helped some of the people. And what I'm trying to do today is something in the similar spirit. Last year, this question answer session continued for about 3 months. And even this year, if there is interest, I'm willing to do something similar. I have no problem with it. Incidentally, I am actually imitating a style which I have learned from Richard Feynman. He used to do something similar at Caltech. Of course, there was no prior warning given to Feynman about what the questions would be. Students will just come and he will answer on the go. And that kind of illustrated his style of thinking and analyzing the questions, which probably he would not have encountered before, and still he will be able to give some answers and even do some calculations. So anyway, that is the sort of motivation behind this interactive session. Unfortunately, the internet and this Microsoft Teams hasn't worked that well, so I'm not in direct connection with the audience, but you will be able to type in the questions and somehow they will get back to me. So let me start with the first question. It was on measurement problem of quantum mechanics. Now this is a problem which still hasn't been solved in the sense of having a dynamical description. So I have to start from the concept at the very beginning. what is measurement? So measurement is a process in which we try to extract some property of the system. Of course, the means which we use for this extraction we call the instrument, but our whole purpose is to understand some property of the system. Obviously, to do that, we have to interact with the system. If there is no interaction with the system, there is nothing we can learn about it. And this is kind of built in, though many times people talk about situations where the system is completely isolated from the rest of the universe. If such systems exist, there is no way anybody can learn anything about it. And that is, well, one illustration is the long time it has taken us to figure out that there is something called dark matter or dark energy in the universe. It was not visible to us by any means before, and now we have been able to interact with those properties using gravitational interactions, nothing else. So gravitational measurements give us some clue that such things exist. We don't have any other evidence for it, and unless we will directly locate them using other interactions like electromagnetic or any other fundamental forces beyond gravity, which we learn about regularly in physics, we will not really know other properties of whatever those dark objects are. So that is the first part. We must interact with the system. Now the question is, what happens during interaction? And here is another feature which we put in from our own requirement, that if you measure some property, you get some result. You measure the same property again, you would like to get the same result. If I measure the same thing several times and each time I keep on getting different answers, then it has no meaning to us in terms of we can call it a property of the object, because the property is not permanent or at least long lived. So we want the measurement to be repeatable. Now this is a requirement not of nature, but it is a requirement for our own understanding. And to have that feature, we have to impose certain restrictions on what is the way we are going to measure. There are different examples of when you get repeatable answer. The trivial example is that the instrument is broken. And so you measure it, you get the same reading every time. But this is not what we want. So this is a situation when there is no interaction with the system. The instrument is behaving whatever it is, it's on your own, it is not responding to the system at all. So even though broken instrument gives us repeatable readings, it is not we would like to call measurement. The next thing is the interaction which we use in a classical sense. In a classical measurement, we say that we measure some property of the system. The system does not change, but the instrument which we have in our control gives a particular reading by changing from one value to another. And that response on the instrument we will call the measured property of the system. But look at the situation here. We are assuming that nothing happens to the system and still something happens to the instrument. This is clearly an asymmetric situation. And how can we make it consistent with physics? In particular, we have principles like action reaction being equal, well, we have to think about it. Are we making the correct assumptions about what we call measurement? And there are answers to this kind of situation also, but that is the classical concept that nothing happens to the system. And so if you repeat the measurement, because the system has not changed, you will get the same answer again. So repeatability is ensured, but not symmetry in terms of interaction between system and the instrument. The third option is what appears in quantum mechanics, where various kind of interactions are written using some sort of operators. And what does the repeatability mean in that particular language? If you apply an operator, you get some result. You apply the same operator again, you should get the same result again. And mathematically, if I call the operator P, this means the operator should be such that P square equal to P. And this is a stringent constraint, that this is a kind of interaction which we must have. And the solution or a mathematical structure of this result, that operator P square is equal to P, is called a projection. And we understand projection much more in a geometrical fashion, that the property can be in some arbitrary space, and when you perform a projection, you will measure one of its components, and the state of the system is going to change from whatever it was to coming along the direction on which we have projected. And if you keep on performing the same measurement over and again, it will project the state which is already projected, and then nothing will change further. So the first projection will change, but any other number of projections afterwards will keep on giving the same answer. So this is also a repetitive property of the measurement, that projection gives a consistent description of measurement. Incidentally, the classical label where nothing happens to the system and we get a reading, it can be described by assuming that the projection operator is nothing but identity. And identity square is equal to identity, nothing happens to the system at all, and that is still a solution to the same equation. So that is the three things which we have encountered. Are there any other solutions to this question of repeatability? I don't know. Maybe somebody will find some other solution someday, and then we have to worry about it. And it's worthwhile to think about that. Are there any other possibility which agree with our concept of measurement being an interaction between the system and the apparatus, and also capable of giving us a repeatable readings? So right now, let us assume that. So how does the projection in quantum mechanics can be reconciled with the classical concept in sense of a limit? Because the two independent theories cannot just work for describing the same system. And our best understanding is that the classical system or classical concepts of various states are some sort of approximation or a limiting behavior of the real quantum world. And this has been successful in several specific cases, and we have good reasons to believe that we should be able to take such a limit. Nobody has proved this kind of things in general, but in certain specific situations, one can actually demonstrate this with rigorous mathematics, and states which are relevant in this particular limit are the so-called coherent states. You may not have heard the phrase coherent states before, but coherent states are the macroscopic limit of quantum states, which you can see at the classical level. And well-known examples of these coherent states are lasers and superconductors. These are systems which behave the same way both in the quantum level and the classical level. And so we can use it at the classical level, and you can also simultaneously give it a quantum description. There is no conflict at all. So what are these coherent states? And they are a little bit peculiar in the sense that they are not eigenstates of Hamiltonian. They are classical states and quantum states, but they are not eigenstates of the Hamiltonian. So if you try to measure value of the Hamiltonian, you will not get a exact answer, but you will get a distribution. Some value of the energy with certain amount of spread around that particular mean value. There is nothing wrong with it. There is no fundamental principle which demands that we always must have eigenstates of Hamiltonian. And the coherent states are actually eigenstates of what is known as an annihilation operator. The annihilation operator in quantum mechanics is used in dealing with many body physics, where there is not just one quantum in the system, but there can be many different quanta in the system, and all these multiple quanta are actually equivalent. If you have studied a little bit of quantum mechanics, such a situation is first encountered in the study of harmonic oscillator, where you have a spectrum where you can have multiple quanta in the system, 0, 1, 2, 3, all the integer values, and each quantum contributes the same amount of energy to the system. And if you have n quanta, the total energy is just n times the energy of one quantum. So here the annihilation operator is defined as a object which takes the state from one value of the quanta to another one. Say it takes you from n quantum state to n minus 1 quantum state. And this operator can be perfectly defined in the mathematical language in quantum mechanics. And this operator can be chosen as the one which you are going to make the eigenstates to define the system. If you say that this annihilation operator is what defines my eigenstates, then those are the coherent states. They are perfectly defined in the classical limit, they are perfectly defined in the quantum limit, and one can just go from one to the another limit by changing the value of n. That the mean value of the quanta can go to 0, that becomes the quantum limit, and it can go to infinity, which becomes the classical limit. Now, what is the importance of this coherent state in the measurement is that if the system is an eigenstate of this annihilation operator, then I can choose this annihilation operator as the interaction between the system and the apparatus. And when I do that, because it's a eigenstate on the part of the system, when I apply that operator, nothing happens to the system, but the apparatus gets one quantum out of the system. Okay, because it does the job of annihilation. So you are extracting one quantum from the system, without changing the system, and that extracted quantum you can measure in as great a detail by any other subsidiary steps as you want, and you can call whatever property is extracted as the property of measurement, so the instrument can show a reading while the system doesn't change. So this is a unusual solution about how you can have the asymmetric behavior of the system and the apparatus, but it is perfectly possible, and we can understand the measurement as something like this has happened during the process of measurement. Okay. Now that is one part of the story has to do with how you actually define the measurement. The second part of the story has to do with the behavior of the projection operators. That if you take the projection operator to be the description of measurement, which is the standard rule in quantum mechanics, it's actually taken to be one of the fundamental axioms that this is what will happen. It's quoted in the textbook as when you measure a quantum system, it will change it to one of the eigenstates of the measured operator, and the reading which you get on the apparatus is one of the eigenvalues of that measured operator. Okay. So there can be many different eigenstates and correspondingly many different eigenvalues, and then there is a Born rule which gives a probabilistic description that sometimes you get this particular eigenstate and sometimes you get some other eigenstate. The reading will be different in different cases, and that gives a generic description given in the textbooks. But this description hides one particular fact, that it makes the measurement probabilistic, and to define probability we will need an ensemble prescription. That is, you are going to get different answers in different trials, and you can ask what is the probability of this particular answer only if you perform the same experiment many times over and over again. So you are assuming that you have a system in some particular state, and you are able to make copies of it or repeat it by some means or the other, so that many different systems which are identical can be prepared. And then you go on making measurements on each one of them one by one and tabulate all the answers, and you can say that this answer came so many times, this answer came so many times, and such result then gives some amount of probability. So this is the measurement description in quantum mechanics, which is probabilistic, and it cannot be defined without using an ensemble. What is the picture in a real experiment? That I can actually do the experiment only once, and I will get one particular answer. Imagine one of those first pictures you encounter for observation of a discrete quantum state, which is called the Stern-Gerlach experiment. That you send an electron through a magnetic field, and on the screen you see two different possibilities as spots. The spin of the electron has a magnetic moment, and the magnetic field deflects it in some particular way. But on the screen you get only two distinct points. One of them is labeled as spin is up, the other one is spin is down. There is nothing in between. So how can this happen? You can say that I am going to reduce the number of electrons which are going through this magnetic field to a very small number, so I can actually count one by one. So I send one electron, it will go and hit one point on the screen. I will send another electron, it will hit another point on the screen, and if I do it many times, I will see the two different spots, and the intensity of the two spots will tell me what is the probability of this component versus that component. But the whole point was that I can observe experiment even if I spend one electron. And do I have a prediction of where it is going to hit on the screen? The current formulation of quantum mechanics does not give an answer. It says you want the probability, you have to repeat the experiment many number of times. If you do it once and ask the question, there is no answer. And that is the incompleteness of our present understanding of quantum mechanics, and that is at the root of the measurement problem. That we can perform measurement of an individual quantum system, but there is no theoretical description of what that answer is going to be. We only have a description in a case where we repeat the same experiment a large number of times. And the trouble is obvious because we can do the experiment one at a time. I mentioned Stern-Gerlach experiment in electron because it's the same thing can be repeated in something which is more familiar perhaps in the situation of optics, that we have all encountered the double slit experiment at some stage. I can again reduce the intensity of the light so that it becomes one photon going after the other slowly, and each photon is going to hit some point on the screen. I can actually see even experimentally that various spots arise as the photons keep on hitting the screen, and only after the photons become large in number, those different spots together give us an interference pattern. So the interference pattern is the inherent nature of the wave dynamics of quantum system, but it is built up using one by one spots on the screen, and we do not have a description of that one by one spot. So this is the essence of the measurement problem. It certainly says that we need something more than the current axioms that we use. Schrodinger equation is not enough. The Born rule is not enough. Something extra is needed. What it is, nobody really has any explicit answer, but the label which has been given to this phenomena is a collapse of the wave function. So for some reason or the other, when you perform the measurement, the wave function collapses. How it collapses, when it collapses, is there a dynamical equation for the collapse? We do not have answers for those. We only have a ensemble or prescription which works only we have done collapse a large number of times, not for individual reason. And this is a part which is open to understanding, and that is the root of the measurement problem. It's not that people have not thought about this question in detail. Essentially, all the great quantum physicists which you may have heard about, they all have made serious attempts to understand this question without any success. And the probable reason about why you cannot answer this kind of questions just based on the theory is that you need some extra help from experiments. experiments do need to tell us something more about what is going on. Is there a trajectory for the photon that is going to describe how it is landing up at some particular point on the screen? What is the intermediate sequence of dynamics for which we don't have a detailed description, and so on and so forth. So this is the measurement problem. We have a probabilistic description. We do not have individual description, and in that sense, the quantum dynamics as we understand so far is incomplete. So this was the first question. The second question, which is kind of linked up with this, concerns the concept of weak measurement. And this is probably the area where experiments can tell us little more about the dynamics of measurement, and maybe they can help in understanding the probabilistic rule which we use in quantum mechanics all the time. So what is the concept of weak measurement? It is rather simple that measurement requires an interaction between the system and the apparatus. We just imagine a situation that this interaction becomes very small, and then try to figure out what happens in such a case. So clearly the measurement process in actual reality takes some time. The projection postulate of quantum mechanics gives a so-called instantaneous description, which is actually discontinuous, but that cannot be the full story. We are allowed to control the duration of the measurement by controlling the strength of the interaction between the system and the apparatus. Perfectly allowed in terms of physical dynamics. And then we can ask what will happen. And this is a part which was not available in experiment for so many years of quantum mechanics, and only within the last 10 years or so we are able to design sophisticated experiments which can actually take us into this particular region. Theoretically, it is not difficult to imagine this kind of situation at all. I talked about the Stern-Gerlach experiment, where the electron is going to pass through a magnetic field. We only have to say that the magnetic field becomes very small, or the time which the electron spends inside the region of magnetic field is very small. That is sort of equivalent. And in that case, what we'll see on the screen is that the two spots on the screen will start coming closer and closer as we reduce the strength of the interaction. And at some stage, they will even overlap. The spots are not actually points. They are some sort of distributions. They can be narrow, but point is a mathematical idealization. So if you have a weak interaction, these two spots actually overlap. And in that particular stage, if you are asked the question whether the spin is up or down, you cannot answer, because the two spots are overlapping. You can only say that maybe it is biased towards being spin up or biased towards spin down, but not a perfect description. So this is what happens in a measurement. The two spots are the so-called eigenstates of the system, which are going to be produced by the projection postulate, but we have tried to imagine a situation where the projection is not complete. It is moving towards there, but it is somewhere in between. And in that sense, the step function or the discontinuous description of projection is now smoothed out. It has become rounded off in some particular way. It is going towards it, but we have kind of caught it in the middle. And now the question is, what will you see in such a experiment when you try to perform it in the real world? And here are the little bit unusual features which show up. One of them is that they're all related to the fact that the final result should correspond to the projection, which is very well defined and very well tested in many experiments. So the dynamics of this weak measurement, which is actually something different. It is not the Schrodinger equation and it is not the projection postulate. You must imagine a different kind of dynamical equation which governs this intermediate state, has to be consistent with the Schrodinger equation and the projection postulate, again being a limiting behavior. That it has to reduce in that case when the coupling becomes large. But when the coupling is small, maybe you can see something in between. So what do you actually see, or rather what does the consistency situation demand? The repeatability of the measurement gives a constraint that whatever the dynamics is of the state going towards one of the eigenstate, it has to have what is known in physics as a fixed point. And fixed point is a state of perfect stability. Once you reach there, you cannot move away from that. That is why it is called fixed. You can imagine as kind of going down a hill and then hitting the bottom, and the bottom is a fixed point that once you reach there, it is not favorable to move anywhere else. So this is a requirement that whatever the equation of weak measurement is, it must have the eigenstates as fixed points. And the other feature is that once you ask these questions, something else which was not part of the quantum mechanics has to be respected, and that is the principle of relativity. And what we learn in special relativity is that there is no specific ordering of time in many different situations for events which occur at different locations. So in one frame, maybe this event occurred earlier, and maybe in another frame, the other event occurred earlier. In quantum theory, this kind of situations poses a problem because many of the operators which we use don't commute with each other. And that does not match with the fact that the indeterminacy of what happens first and what happens second will actually interchange the order of operators. So how do we get around that? And the only obvious solution to this particular fact is that we make these properties as constants of motion, that there are certain features which don't change, and when they don't change, it doesn't matter in which order you measure. Maybe this is measured first and that is measured second. The answers will not depend on the order, and the one quantity which we have to make as a constant of motion in case of measurement is the Born rule itself, that we are going to get some probabilities for various events. We don't know in which order they will be measured because we are dealing with these weak measurements, and so for everything to remain consistent, the dynamics of the weak measurement should be such that Born rule is a constant of motion. So it doesn't matter at which stage you measure, the answers will not change. And such a description of weak measurement actually exists. There is a fixed point behavior. The Born rule is a constant of motion, but the in-between behavior is peculiar in the sense that you are starting at some stage, you are going towards one eigenstate, but the flow is not monotonic. It is a zigzag evolution which takes place. Sometimes you move towards one eigenstate, then you suddenly change your mind and move towards another eigenstate, and have some dynamics which describes this kind of motion, and then you get the correct probability. So there is an explicit solution, but with this intermediate dynamics is a zigzag. This is actually one solution which is demonstrated to be consistent with all the rules of quantum mechanics. We cannot say that there is no other solution. Maybe somebody else will find some other solution, but this solution definitely exists. And the zigzag behavior actually has analogs in what we have known in statistical mechanics, well, in the phenomena which is known as diffusion or Brownian motion. That if you look at individual atomic motion, even in an average fluid dynamics flow, the atoms are going all over the place, bouncing around this way and that way, and then you average over the whole thing, you get a smooth description. So the Brownian motion can be actually seen with a microscope. If you draw dynamics, you will see all kind of a zigzag pattern which is happening over there. And the quantum description of this weak measurement, if you try to observe it at taking various time slices, stroboscopic kind of picture which can be done, you see this kind of pattern. It's a zigzagging pattern which gives it the correct probabilistic description, and the equation is peculiar because it has this random feature. The statistical mechanics, the zigzag dynamics is obtained by adding a noise to the system, and we take the noise to be coming from the non-zero temperature of the system, called it thermal fluctuations or whatever, but there is a source of these fluctuations, and these fluctuations are there on part of an average flow, and together with that, the average flow and the fluctuation make a complete description. So the weak measurement actually can be understood in this particular way, that there is an average flow which takes you from the initial state to the eigenstate, and on top of that there are fluctuations which do all kind of zigzag and which produce a probabilistic behavior which you also see in quantum mechanics. This equation is highly unusual. It is non-linear, and we don't know what is the source of the fluctuation. In statistical mechanics, you easily put the source that it is a finite temperature which does this, but in quantum mechanics we do not know what the source of the fluctuation is, but that actually gives us a correct description. There is an equation, and this equation does not have any parameter other than the coupling between the system and the apparatus. The mathematical form of the interaction is completely fixed by the demands that you have certain fixed points and you must produce the Born rule as average behavior. To do that, there is only one parameter, which is the coupling between the system and the apparatus, and which is actually a measure of the length of measurement process. You make a coupling small, measurement takes a long time. If you make a coupling large, measurement is instantaneous like a projection. And this is as far as we have understood, and that help has come definitely from performing this weak measurement experiments. The part which is open is what is the source of these fluctuations and the noise, and nobody has a clear answer to that. It is something beyond what we use in quantum mechanics, but it is necessary to produce this probabilistic description. What we have done is kind of traded off one thing of the other, got rid of the probabilistic description. Now you have these zigzag trajectories which actually describe behavior of individual systems in a quantum experiment. And when you average over these trajectories for a large number of processes, you will get back the Born rule and whatever else. So you have a some sense microscopic description of this probabilistic process. That is the knowledge we have kind of acquired from these weak measurement experiments. It obviously creates a new question that yes, now we have got rid of the probabilistic part. We understand that, we understand the individual description of the dynamics, but the individual description is a function of noise and these fluctuations. And what is the origin of this noise and the fluctuation? We don't yet know. We still have to search for something deeper than quantum mechanics. It cannot be part of the usual quantum mechanics. It has to be something much more fundamental, occurring at a probably a completely different scale, and it's a open question. What is known is that this description of this kind of noisy processes obey a kind of a fundamental rule. In the diffusion theory, it is called the fluctuation dissipation theorem. And the fluctuation dissipation theorem of this weak dynamics is nothing but the Born rule. So Born rule, which we assume in the usual quantum mechanics, it becomes fluctuation dissipation theorem at a deeper level with a new question about, we still have to find a understanding of where the fluctuations are coming from. So that is as much as I can say about the concept of weak measurement. It is a little bit more technical if you want to understand it further, because it requires you solving specific equations. The equations are not too complicated, but these equations which have noise built inside it, called the diffusion equations, requires a certain amount of technical ideas and tricks to find the correct solutions. They're part of the standard machinery of mathematics that deals with partial differential equations, but one has to learn a little bit about that to be able to answer that question. So this is the lesson of measurement, that the problem is there. We have its rough understanding, but there is something missing. And we still don't have a complete understanding of quantum mechanics until we find the missing ingredient. So this is the stage where I can actually take some of the questions which you may have, because other question will be on a different topic. whatever I can say next. So somebody will have to relay the questions to me.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions regarding measurement, and one of the question asks, what is the basis on which this mathematical act of assigning an operator corresponds to the physical act of measuring some physical quantity?
In the quantum theory, the interaction is described by some particular operator. That is a generic behavior that every part of the dynamics or every evolution in the dynamics of quantum mechanics is governed by some particular operator. If you don't do anything, it will just be the unperturbed Hamiltonian. If you add a new interaction, it will be something on top of the original Hamiltonian. But that is the part which you added, and the reading or the signature which you get on the operators is the eigenvalue and the eigenstate of the interaction Hamiltonian. Because that is the perturbation which you are adding to the system, and you are looking at the response of that particular interaction. So what you get on the instrument depends on the interaction Hamiltonian which you sent in. The interaction Hamiltonian could just be the position, and then what you see in the apparatus is the position. It could be momentum, it could be energy, it could be any thing which you will consider as a physical property. You can write a corresponding operator, and if you use that operator to interact with the system, that is the reading which you are going to get on the apparatus. The only thing is that all these operators, by constructions, they are taken to be Hermitian, and so the readings which we get on the apparatus, they are the eigenvalues of Hermitian operators, and so they are real numbers. And we can only observe real numbers on the apparatus. We cannot observe anything else. We can deduce other things, but everything which is observed on the apparatus is actually a real number.
Thank you, sir. There are other questions. So Govinda asks, can the error in the quantum system be utilized to enhance the coherence of the system? In other words, like, is it possible to use the errors themselves to enhance some properties which you might desire in your quantum system?
Well, the apparatus are never perfect, and there will be some errors, in the sense that I initially started out by imposing a restriction of repeatability, but in reality you will not get repeatable measurement even in the classical experiments which you perform. You get slight variation, and that is because the actual systems are not the same as the ideal setup which we imagine. So there are fluctuations coming from imperfections in the design of the experiment itself. That is a different story, and they do add to the uncertainty of the answer which you see. But this uncertainty in the design of the apparatus has nothing to do with the inherent uncertainty which will be there in the dynamics of the quantum system itself. So there are two sources of fluctuations or uncertainty. One is something which is there in the system, the other is something which is there in the apparatus. And reality, actually, you can do a good job to separate these two.
Thank you, sir. So Govind also asked that how can we utilize weak measurement principles to cause the least amount of decoherence?
Decoherence is a different story. That's again a concept of generalizing the measurement. I mean, there are questions like this which have been tantalizingly put in many discussions, that is the moon really there where nobody looks at it? What is the answer? And these kind of questions at some stage become too philosophical and kind of impossible to say one way or the other. The labels which are used in these discussions go by two different words. One of them is called ontology, which means what is real irrespective of any observer. And the second is what is knowledgeable, what we can actually comprehend by all the instruments which are under control. And these two parts are not necessarily the same. They are well, different philosophical repercussions for that, and I will not go into discussion of that. But the fundamental point is just this: what is real and what is knowable, and what we can answer in a concrete fashion are only the things which are knowable. If something which is there but which has no interaction with the rest of the universe, there is no way anybody can know anything about it or make any statement about it. And these labels therefore are there, but the physics itself concerns with only the things which are knowable and not other philosophical question that something which is present but we can't interact with it. So that is the story. So what becomes the generalized concept of measurement? It is not necessary that the measurement needs a conscious observer looking at the instrument. It can be generalized to the stage where any interaction with the system, with its surroundings, can be called a measurement. And the interaction between the system and the surrounding, whatever it is, becomes a measurement operator. It doesn't matter whether anybody looks at it or not, because mathematical point of view, you have an interaction, it is going to change the system and the surroundings in some particular way, and that is no different than the surroundings being replaced by an instrument. Instrument is a one particular kind of surrounding. And then one can ask the same question, what is going to happen? Well, lots of things that happen when the system interacts with the surroundings, and the most common process is basically elastic scattering as far as quantum theory is concerned at the fundamental level. The reason it is elastic because the fundamental laws are all reversible in time, almost perfectly. Little bit exception of that, but that is ignored. So there is this interaction. Mostly it is elastic. That means there will be lots of quantities which will be conserved, just like the collision between different objects in the classical physics. Energy, momentum, all those things are obviously conserved, but there are things which change and which are the scattering angles. And in the quantum mechanics, these scattering angles appears in the phases of the wave function. You may have learned a little bit of quantum mechanics, but that is what happens when we describe a scattering of a quantum process in a elastic region. The phase of the wave function changes, and then one can ask what happens with the environment, which is having this kind of interaction which changes the phases of the wave function. And the result is that there can be lots of different collisions which we cannot keep track of because nobody keeps track of the environment, and too many collisions will put in too many uh, phases. And if you look at that, the final description, the phases are all completely randomized because they go all over the place. And so the only meaningful reason you can extract is not the phase of the wave function, but the magnitude of the wave function. And the magnitude of the wave function is exactly what comes as a probability in the Born rule. So this is a description of decoherence. It is called decoherence because the phases are getting randomized. All the meaning of the phases is lost. In particular, phases are absolutely necessary if you want to observe an interference phenomena. When you have decoherence, the interference phenomena is wiped out. All you are left is with magnitudes. It describes the so-called projection postulate, where all the knowledge which is left is the probability or the corresponding magnitude of that particular component, and everything else is gone. So in a sense, it is a discussion or a description of how the projection uh, of quantum phenomena can come about, but it does not have the same depth or rigor as the weak dynamics. The reason being that this decoherence is still an ensemble phenomena. To be able to obtain the mathematical behavior of decoherence, you must imagine there are lots and lots of collisions and average over the whole thing. You are not asking the question about what happens in one particular collision. And so it is not a description of an individual measurement, but it is a description of an average of a large number of measurements. By measurement in this case, I mean interaction with the environment. And if you do that, you will get the probabilistic description of quantum physics back, and that is what the theory of decoherence produces. And it has its equations, and you can derive some things from it, but these are still equation at the level of an ensemble and not at the level of individual trajectories.
So there is a question closely related to this, and that is about the existence of a multiverse. So the question is by Aditya Krishnan, and he asks, how valid is this argument of the existence of a multiverse with respect to the results of Schrodinger's cat thought experiment?
The multiverse is not really an answer to anything. It is just pushing the question under the carpet, so to speak. You have a probabilistic description, and that says that with some probability you will get this result, some probability you will get this result, some probability you will get this result, and so on. And what multiverse says is that every time you perform measurement, the universe splits into so many different components. In one universe, you will get one particular eigenstate of measurement in another universe, you get another eigenstate of the measurement, and what you really end up seeing in your particular experiment only shows the result of your universe. There are an infinite number of other universes where different things have happened, but you have no clue about what has happened over there, and there is no description of how the universe is going to split every time there is a measurement, or more generally, every time there is an interaction. So this is a very kind of odd feature. You can throw around words, but the multiverse actually doesn't answer anything at all. It just postpones the question to the next level. Schrodinger's cat is the same. It says in one universe the cat is alive, the other one is the cat is dead, and you are, if this universe you will see cat alive, you are in that universe you will see cat dead. That doesn't answer anything at all. And when you are going to split the universe, you have to take care of all the probabilities, that how often you will end up in this universe versus that universe. Those kind of questions have no answer. So yeah, you can talk about this kind of things, and philosophical discussion keep on going about this kind of labels, but they do not give any concrete answers.
Thank you, sir. So we do have many more questions, but these are not related to the the measurement that we had been discussing. So, like, would you like to take these questions later or now?
It doesn't matter. I can talk about things as long as you have energy to listen.
Okay, surely, sir. So this is a question from Raghav Sa, who asks, when photon collides with electron in Compton effect, why do we not talk about the size of photon, as there must be a cross-sectional area of collision? Also, this assumption that the electron is a point particle, does this contradict this viewpoint of collision having a cross-sectional area related to it?
Yes, there are sizes of particles. The size of a photon is actually just its wavelength. There is no other scale parameter at all which you can associate with a photon other than its wavelength. And so if you want to treat the wavelength of the photon at its size, it's perfectly legitimate. And there is no conflict with any principle at all. For other object like a proton or a neutron, we can actually experimentally measure its size. You can say that it's so many femtometers or something like that. And we have ways to do that using some kind of scattering experiments only, and that is perfectly okay. About the electron, mathematically we treat it as a point particle, but you can try doing various kind of tests to ascertain what its size is, and all the best experiments so far have only come up with a bound that the size of the electron is less than some 10 raised to minus 17 meters or so. So experiments can only do that. All experiments which we have in all our instruments are never going to give us a precise value. They are only given to give us bounds, maybe some mean value with some range around it. And that is a fact of the real world, because a point which corresponds to a zero or infinity, they are mathematically completely okay, but they have no place in physics. And so electron, yes, you try measuring it, you can say that it is smaller than this. If your theory works in that particular range, so the theories also have their limits. The theory will work between this particular scale and that particular scale. And if the electron size is smaller than the range in which theory works, we can treat the electron as a point particle. No problem with that. And that is the status of quantum electrodynamics. If we know it works in a certain range, electron is much smaller compared to all the scales which you are dealing with it, so you can treat it as a point particle. There is no inconsistency coming because of that assumption.
Okay, there is a question by Ritapriya Pradhan, and she asks, what is the state of a particle which is undergoing quantum tunneling when it is in that region of the barrier potential? So does it exist in that region for some real and finite time interval, or is it something else?
Well, it goes through in the standard description of quantum mechanics in the form of a wave function, which will give you probabilities that if you allow it to tunnel a large number of times and keep on observing this region, it will tell you how often it is there. But if you are asking a question of what happens in an individual tunneling experiment, the current quantum theory is incomplete, just as in the case of measurement. There is no answer. And you can try constructing a description of it. It will have a similar structure to what happens in case of a weak measurement. The barrier is nothing but some kind of interaction, and you can ask what is the zigzagging kind of trajectory which will happen inside and try to investigate its consequences. That is possible, but the individual answer quantum mechanics cannot provide.
So now there are a couple of questions regarding quantum computation. So, sir, would you like to talk about quantum computation before taking these questions, or
Okay, I can go to that particular topic in this list which you had given.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, there is a question about quantum algorithm, complexity classes, and what kind of problems it will solve, etc., etc. Okay.
Yes.
So here again, I have to start at the basics. What do you mean by a problem? So problem is defined in the context of some particular definitions made in some particular system of a language or axioms or whatever it is. That is how the mathematics goes about. That you given a list of assumptions and definitions, and then you are told from this list and assumption, I write down a question, and then you are supposed to give a derivation which will give you a final answer to that particular question. So what are the things which are known, or rather rigorously proved in this kind of situation? And that has a lot to do with algorithms and complexity. The first rather surprising statement is that you can have a fully consistent axiomatic description of mathematics and the rules. But in any such system, there will always be some problems which cannot be answered. So this is known as incompleteness of mathematics. Just like I said, there is some incompleteness of quantum mechanics. This is actually far more rigorous. The mathematics is incomplete. You have all the definitions, no inconsistency, and still you can't answer questions. So this was a theorem which was proved by Gödel, and mathematicians had a hard time coming to terms with it, but it is true, and it is at the basis of one of the fundamental concepts in computers is there is a incompleteness problem which is called a halting problem. The halting problem is a statement that you are given a complete definition of a computer, you are given a complete list of instructions, you have no inherent contradiction or inconsistency in these definitions, and you ask a very simple question that if I give a particular program to this computer, and computer knows how to go from one step to the next because all the instructions are very well known. I want to know whether the program will continue forever or it will stop at some stage. And the surprising result is this question cannot be answered. So there is a halting problem. You have a program, you have a computer, you give the program to the computer, but you have no idea whether the computer is going to stop and give you an answer, it is going to keep on running forever. And this situation arises because of the particular structure which is allowed in languages, which is called recursion. Or there are these loops that one can ask that to answer this particular step, I can put a condition that it has to ask the same question to a different input again. For example, you can write a simple function like a factorial. What is n factorial? It is saying that it is n times n minus 1 factorial. So you have a recursive process which says that I can calculate n factorial provided I know what is n minus 1 factorial. So this is the instruction possible in the program, but once you have such recursive instructions available in a computer, there is a problem, the halting problem, which says you have no idea whether the computer will stop or it will keep on going forever. So this is the first thing to keep in mind, that you say there is a problem which is well defined with all the rules of logic, but there can be problems for which we cannot tell whether there is an answer or not. So then you go to a simplified question. Okay, forget about all these unanswerable problems. We will deal with only problems for which there is an answer. And then you can restrict your possible types of problems to this smaller class, and the complexity then is defined in terms of the resources required to solve that particular problem. And resources are all physical quantities in some sense or the other, like how long the computer will run, it is the time resource, how much memory and disk space the computer will need, it is a space problem. In practice, there are other requirements, how much power the computer will require, that is the energy problem. So there are these physical resources which are needed to solve that particular problem, and complexity is a definition or rather a measure of how large or small these resources are. And typically the complexity is defined in the kind of limiting behavior, because otherwise there will be quite a lot of complicated functions which can arise. So you ask the question of complexity, that what is the resources required, where the size of the input, or the size of the input becomes large. So if you call the input n, you have to take limit n going to infinity, and in that limit, only the fastest growing function will survive. All the others can be ignored, as is easy to understand from mathematics. And the fastest rate of growth is used as a identification of the complexity of a particular problem. And the two particular features which are discussed, one of them is called polynomial, and another is, well, something worse than polynomial. Many times it is exponential, but it doesn't have to be exponential. It can be other kind of super polynomial functions as well. And that is a kind of classification. There is a open question, is there a proof that this polynomial problems are actually different than the super polynomial problems? And the answer is there is no proof, and it is only a belief that they are different, because nobody has been able to find a answer. So there is actually a cartoon in one of these complexity books which is worth looking at, and that is saying that the boss tells his employee, go and solve this particular problem. The employee can't solve the problem. So what does he go and tell the boss? So one possibility is that the employee just goes and tell the boss that I'm not smart enough, I can't solve the problem. But there are other possibilities as well. If the employee is cleverer, he can probably construct a proof that this problem cannot be solved. So that is another problem, that I can't just solve the problem, but because the problem cannot be solved by anybody. And there is a third option, where the employee takes a group of his friends to the boss and says, I can't solve the problem, and all my friends are also very smart, but they can't solve the problem either. So there is something peculiar about this particular problem. And the classification of computer science is in the last category, that there are situations basically saying that this has been solved up to this particular level, and he has found anything different. That doesn't guarantee anything at all, that maybe there is a smart person in future will come or completely overhaul the whole understanding of the subject. It's completely open situation, but the understanding of all the classification of complexity is at this level, that many people have tried, and this is the best they were able to do. Okay. So the polynomial class is there, that people have tried and they have found a polynomial solution to the problem. There are more difficult problems where solutions, nobody has found a polynomial solution. But here you put another constraint, and that comes from the incompleteness of the mathematics, etc. That one can give a random answer to this difficult problem. And how will you know that its answer is right or wrong? And the scenario which is constructed is that these difficult problems have a physically useful meaning when the answer can be easily verified. So they define a problem there. The standard methods don't give a polynomial solution, but if a solution is given, it can be verified in a polynomial time. And this class of problems where the solution is not necessarily polynomial, but the verification is polynomial, is labeled NP. The N actually stands for non-deterministic polynomial complexity class. And these are the problems which are practically useful because if somebody produces the answer, you can quickly check whether it is true or not. If the answer is too difficult to check, it doesn't serve much purpose at all. It's more or less at the same level that you assume something and go along. And that scenario mathematically is allowed, but physically nobody worries much about it. So all the practical problems are in either of these two labels, P and NP, and there is no mathematical proof that this P is equal to NP or it is not equal to NP. It's just a belief that the two are separate, and so there are problems that are difficult to solve but easy to verify. And we know some examples of this from our own arithmetic, that factorizing a large number is not so easy because you have to do a lot of trial and error kind of analysis to find the factors. But if you are given the factors, you can easily verify that they are the correct factors by doing ordinary multiplication. And multiplication is quick. So there can be this kind of asymmetric situation where solution is difficult, but verification is easy. And the practical problems are therefore classified in this two labels, polynomial and non-deterministic polynomial. And of course, then the question comes about anything which is going to change once we change the rules of the game, which are the definitions or the mathematical axioms under which these problems are supposed to be solved. And for a long time, it was assumed that the classical mathematics which we have, which is all used in all the computer science anyway, has given a understanding which is essentially complete. That turned out to be a false promise. And what quantum dynamics brought forward is that there could be certain problems where no easy classical solution is known, but one can construct an easy quantum solution. And so that will convert the problems under all the assumptions which I have mentioned before, which are not polynomial in the classical framework, but they become polynomial in the quantum framework. And the excitement about quantum computers is because of these particular possibilities, that there were all kind of difficult problems, but maybe they will become easy. There is no systematic way to find out which problems are going to become easy, but there have been specific instances that have illustrated that this problem becomes little bit easier on the quantum logic than it is on the classical logic. And those are the things which people are exploring. Of course, such proofs all depends on the assumptions you make. And so the conditions about defining the problems have to be carefully scrutinized. And if you look at the computer science description, they will go through a careful description of all the conditions of the problems, and then there will be a statement that yes, this can be done with this much resources, and that will classify that it is easy or how difficult, and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of a statement about our understanding. The label like P and NP, their analogs exist in the quantum dynamics as well. So there are problems which can be solved by polynomial resources in quantum dynamics, but there are also problems which nobody knows how to solve by polynomial resources. They are the analog of NP in classical logic. There are difficult problems in quantum logic as well, and they will be kind of examples that difficult to solve but easy to verify kind of problems. They also exist in quantum logic. All the thrill or the advertisement of quantum computer is that the quantum classification and the classical labels, they don't exactly match. So what is something in NP, maybe it is in the quantum polynomial time, and then we will be able to do something powerfully, much more easily in the real world. So that is the status. Now, there is a completely different viewpoint of a physicist into this mathematical jargon, and that is in nature, whatever has happened or whatever we can see happening is all done with finite resources, that is finite number of components and finite amount of time. So what we can observe in nature is actually only the kind of easy problems, because nature doesn't have arbitrary large resources. It only has finite resources. We have seen how much space it takes. We have seen how much time it takes. And so if you understand the natural laws or the rules correctly, you would be able to imitate nature and do the same thing with the similar amount of resources. So if the problem is easy for nature, it should be easy for my computer too. If you find that some natural problem is difficult for my computer, it then tells you that you have not understood the nature probably in the right sense, and or not implemented the natural laws in the computer in proper sense. And here is what the quantum theory promises, that yes, it is a rule of nature. If I put it in the correct sense, in the computer, it will solve all the natural problems just as well as nature has solved themselves all these problems with whatever resources which we have. And so the question is now interesting for a physicist. If you understood the nature correctly, you should be able to mimic it. And if you are not able to mimic it, that means you have not understood nature correctly. Both ways, there is interesting job for the physicists to work on, and that is the excitement for a physicist of why they are looking in this mathematical jargon of various kind of complexity description and resources required for solutions to problems. Okay, I would stop at that.
Thank you very much, sir. So we have a couple of questions regarding quantum computation, and one of them is from Akash Kumar Singh, who asks, how are quantum data stored in physical computers?
Okay, that brings another aspect of what our problems are. Our problems and their answers both are going to be classical. That is because of our own status as classical creatures, so to speak. We can write the problems, we can talk about it, we can look at the results. All these things, the input and output of a so-called computer are always going to be classical, because we cannot understand quantum problems at all. It is our own limitation. I mean, quantum theory for will allow example of a superposition of two computers, but we have no clue about what that means. So the problems which we look at, they're always going to be classical. What is quantum is the conversion or the process which takes from input to output. So in a quantum computer, you will take a classical input, convert it into quantum data, run the quantum instructions to reach the output. There will be a quantum output, and you will convert the quantum output back into classical output. And this is the way a quantum computer has to be understood. It is just a different route to solve the same problem. The problems are always classical. And yes, you can design a different route depending on how you map the classical input and the classical output into quantum input and a quantum output. That is your freedom. It's a choice. You have to construct a map or a design or whatever you want to call it. There are different candidates possible, and well, there are no unique answers, but you can say that I can take this particular route and see what happens. If it gives you answers with less number of resources, that will be useful in practice. Okay.
So this question is from Akash Jain, who asks that quantum computers can solve pre-existing encryption algorithms like the RSA very easily. So what are the plans in place to come up with better algorithms which won't be affected by quantum computation?
It's a what you call heavily invested area of research. Lot of it because of the security questions are involved. And as I said that there are problems which are difficult for quantum computers. They have not gone away. Only thing is that number of such problems may have become smaller, but there are problems which are difficult for quantum computers. So you can use those problems to define your cryptographical codes. So there is a label which is given to this kind of research. One of them is called post-quantum cryptography. Another is called quantum resistant cryptography. But in simpler words, it means design of classical cryptography protocols which cannot be broken easily even by a quantum computer. such things exist, at least as far as we take all the assumption about various complexity classes into account. And so people are working very hard um, to find explicit implementation. It's true that the RSA turns out to be an example which is easily broken by a quantum computer, but there exist other possibilities, and you have to find a practical scheme which is in this particular category. And of course, there is a lot of money to be made in this particular area because of all the security aspects. A lot of governments and also finance industries are willing to pay you if you can come up with even a reasonably uh, good enough idea. You don't have to be the best in the business, but if you can move it a little bit, maybe you can get a lot of advertisement for your work.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt. I think that's all the questions we are going to be taking today because it unfortunately we seem to have run out of time. So we would like to continue this at a later time as which we can schedule afterwards when both the professor and all the organizers are available. And yeah, so now I would like to propose the vote of thanks. Just give me a second. I will turn my video on. So, firstly, sir, I would like to thank you for doing this, and to the audience and to sir, I would like to apologize on behalf of Team Decoherence for the initial technical difficulties we faced that led to the delay in the beginning of the talk. We regret any inconvenience caused, and we will work to ensure that this doesn't happen again in the future. Secondly, we would like to thank Professor Apurva D. Patel for taking time out of his busy day to give this extremely fascinating talk on some basics of quantum mechanics and computation and enlightening us about the interesting problems and phenomena seen in relation to this, and as well as telling us about the unsolved questions in this field. We hope that it definitely inspired the audience, and I can say I definitely am inspired to read more on this topic. So, yeah.